Welcome to Living Blind. I'm Jeffrey Rainey, the podcast producer and your guest host for this episode. The Living Blind podcast is brought to you by Balance for Blind Adults, located in Toronto, Canada, and this season of Living Blind is sponsored by Accessible Media Incorporated. Here at Living Blind, we explore the perspectives and lived experiences of people with sight loss and delve into barriers, challenges, and real-life strategies for living life to the fullest. This episode is the final installment for Season 3, so we thought we'd have some fun with a Throwback Thursday edition. One of the prizes for our top donors for the most recent Because of Balance campaign was the chance to come on the podcast and talk about a favorite episode. We are very pleased to have Elizabeth Mohler with us to do exactly that. Elizabeth raised a whopping $2,343 for Balance, and thus was a leading fundraiser. And she agreed to select an episode that was meaningful to her to feature this month. One of our early episodes, Mental Health Matters with Lisa Derencinovic, was very popular when we first dropped it in Season 1 back in 2021. We have decided to replay Lisa's episode here, immediately followed by my interview with Elizabeth about her takeaways and tie-ins with her own work and life. As you may recall, Lisa is a registered social worker and psychotherapist and runs her own practice, Counseling with Lisa. She also provides Balance clients with mental health counseling and has been the professional moderator for one of our mental health support groups over the past 6 years. Enjoy this listen or re-listen for some, and then I'll be back with my interview with Elizabeth and her commentary after a message from our sponsor. And now, here's Lisa.
Thank you for having me.
Can you start by telling the listeners a little bit about you?
Sure. So my name is Lisa Derencinovic. My career is I'm a registered social worker and I have my own private counseling practice. I also live with vision loss. I was diagnosed at age 4 with RP and then re-diagnosed in my early 20s with Bardet-Biedl syndrome. So it's a progressive genetic eye disease. And right now I use a white cane and I use JAWS to access the computer.
Thank you. Where to get started? Maybe can you talk a little bit about how you got interested in social work and counseling?
Sure. So I actually didn't start out in social work. I actually started out taking a degree in English literature at the University of Toronto. At that point, I wanted to be a writer, but I sort of shortly came to the conclusion that I wasn't good enough to be a writer and that I also didn't have the self-discipline it takes to be a writer. So I had to kind of think, what else did I want to do? And during that time, I had been participating in a peer support group where I was helping to co-facilitate, and I really enjoyed that experience. And so that led me towards considering social work. And so then I went to Ryerson and did an undergrad and a master's program in social work there. And during my master's degree, I did a counseling placement and I found it really rewarding. So then after I graduated, I did do some community work where it was more group facilitation based. And that is still something that I do. I do that with Balance, and then I've done that with other groups as well too. But now I kind of focus more on my counseling one-on-one work. And so that, has been something that has really, been an opportunity that I've quite enjoyed as a social worker.
Mm-hmm. You use your lived experience as well as something you draw on in your work. Can you talk a little bit about how that comes together with the academic or the practical professional side?
For sure. I think ideally it's great when, a worker does use their lived experience as well as their professional experience. And in general, we still are people. So even if we don't have the same lived experience as the people we're working with, we still bring a lot of ourselves and our values into the work. And so for me, working with the partially sighted and blindness community, when that is my lived experience, I can definitely, relate to what people are going through. I've gone through some of what, some of my clients have gone through myself. So there's definitely a connection and an understanding that sometimes I don't find with other counselors. But I also have to be aware that my experience is not the only experience of vision loss. I was born with sight, so someone who is born blind, we have a different experience. And then also looking outside of just the vision loss, I've worked with people who, even though we might have the vision loss in common, there's lots of other aspects of our social identity that are different. So I always have to be aware of both the similarities and the differences when I'm working with someone.
Can you speak to, are there kind of common situations or experiences that come up? Of course, keeping in mind that everyone is so different, right?
Yes.
But in your experience, are there certain challenges that come up on a frequent basis?
So looking more sort of at the people who have more of the progressive vision loss or maybe sudden vision loss, there is a commonality between the adjustment process. And so sort of needing to think of themselves as someone who is visually impaired, partially sighted, or blind, whatever term they want to use, as opposed to thinking of themselves as a sighted person. And that's experience that I found that a lot of people struggle with. But when they can sort of switch that perspective, it can be really an opportunity for that acceptance and growth.
How so?
Because a lot of times I find people are still trying to do things in a way as if they were a sighted person. So they're trying to use their limited amount of vision, and their limited amount of vision is not really enough vision to do what they want to do. And whereas if they were, to try and maybe do it in a more tactile or hearing way, then it would, it might be more successful. And just also it can be a way of trying to hang on to things in terms of, how we think of ourselves. And, not that we have to think of ourselves as being disabled, but just sort of, having that feeling of acceptance can bring about a letting go of some of the barriers that we might have around how we think of ourselves. So it can actually make things easier sometimes.
Right. I like your point that you made about trying to do things a certain way, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you're used to, or that is, an able-bodied person may go about doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And then to think, if I can accept my situation, I can move forward and do things in a way that works for me.
Yeah.
Versus trying to fit, my identity and my life into the box that I used to be in, right?
For sure. Yeah, because it's not to say that everything that we used to do, we can't do anymore. But there might be things that you can do, but you have to do them differently. And it's finding that way of how to do it differently that can really be, again, that opening or that opportunity to find a way to do the things that you want to do or that you used to do.
Right. And I think this brings me to another topic, which is, counseling, or at least I think a lot of people might have the impression that counseling is very person-centered or oriented around what the person can change. But there's a lot of things that are going on in society that would affect someone coming in for counseling. So can you speak a little bit to, ableism or disableism, what's going on in our society in Canada?
Sure.
I know that's a very big topic, but how is the world around your clients influencing their thoughts, their feelings about themselves, or just anything in general?
Definitely. So there's many levels that ableism affects the person. And, so there's the systemic levels. There's more of the institutional levels, there's the family levels, and then there's the individual levels. And so all of these are interacting at the same time. And, ableism, it looks at the discrimination and harassment of people with disabilities, but it also looks at the limiting of opportunities and the barriers that people with disabilities face. And sometimes these can be attitudinal barriers, and those attitudinal barriers can come from people, outside of us in society. They can come from our family members, or they can even also come from ourselves. So understanding what those attitudinal barriers are and how they affect, our experiences can be a way to sort of shift sometimes how we're feeling and how we're behaving and what we're thinking of.
Mm-hmm. And that's something that sometimes people would work through with you in a session? Definitely,
yes. But I will definitely label when someone is talking about something that might be ableism, and it's something that I talk about a lot with my clients. Can contribute to a lot of emotions. It can bring about anger or sadness or grief or frustration. And, all of those things, sometimes, we try and figure out where they're coming from, and the person might blame themselves for what they're feeling. Yet when we bring that social lens into it, it can open it up and give a different perspective to what the person is experiencing.
Mm-hmm. On that note, I'm thinking about when people come to see you for counseling, what do you usually do to help them prepare, or what can they expect in terms of how the process works?
Mm-hmm. So depending, sometimes I will have a short conversation with a person before we start our first session. And that is to give them a little bit of information about what the counseling process is like and what my style is and what they can expect. And then also they can ask any questions. So sometimes that happens. Sometimes we go straight to the first session. And within the first session, there is the structure of kind of doing some questions to get information from them about what their past experiences has been like. I usually also ask if they have any specific counseling goals that they want to work on. And that can be very general or it can be very specific. And based on that, we just kind of keep going. And I mean, the counseling process at its basis is a conversation. And so it's a give and take between myself as the counselor and the client. And, so we just talk about what they're experiencing, what their day-to-day is like, and kind of take it from there. And it sort of kind of flows from one topic to the other.
So it's, I want to say unstructured, but it's not exactly. Maybe the better word, it's that the client is in the driver's seat when it comes to what they want to talk about and what they want to work through. And your role is to, well, maybe you'd be best at telling me what you feel like your role is in that conversation.
Sure. So I see myself as sort of like a guide on their journey. So I keep track of where we've been and where we're going. And so I might, if we've been doing multiple sessions, I might talk about like, okay, so last time, we talked about this. Where are you with that? Or, your goal was to work on this. Where are we with that? But definitely, if there's something that the person wants to talk about, that's very urgent to talk about that day, that is where I start from. And yeah, I would say my approach is definitely not very structured. There might be some counselors who have a more structured approach than I do, but mine is a little bit more kind of following where the conversation goes. I feel that like if we go from one topic to another, that's where the conversation needed to go.
And do you ever find that people are kind of hesitant to try counseling, or they have fears or concerns?
For sure. I mean, they're telling their life story to someone that they don't know anything about. So it can sometimes feel like a very vulnerable situation. Sometimes just even making that first inquiry, that first phone call or email can be the hardest part. So sometimes, when you have started to talk to someone and you feel like you're being listened to and you feel like you have a space to talk about things that you might not have anyone else to talk about, it can relieve some of those fears or concerns at first.
Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like there's a bit of a that first step can be a little bit scary for a lot of people. It's like you said, you're going and talking a lot of things that are on your mind or quite private to somebody who's a stranger in that moment. So yeah.
I guess the other thing to reassure people is that everything within the counseling process, except for certain limitations, is confidential. So I'm not going to talk to my friends about, what my clients are telling me. There's very strict limits on when and how I can break confidentiality. And those instances where I would break confidentiality are very specific. And I actually tell everyone before we start our first session what the limits to confidentiality are. It's part of my opening spiel.
I'm sure that it's reassuring. It may be that if somebody hasn't done counseling before, that you're right. That's something that a person may not be familiar with, the structure and the professional boundaries and things like that. So makes sense. Taking a different direction. I know we talked about your counseling work. I guess here's a big question for you. Can you talk a little bit about your thoughts on what, thinking about vision and mental health, like what experiences or what things have you come across in either your professional or your personal experience that affects the community, if there's anything in particular? So for example, like I'm thinking about blindness and mental health and what are, unique needs of the community. So to give you an example, I've heard that, and it's a really unfortunate fact or statistics, but I heard a lot of people would say they'd rather die than go blind. Right. So I've heard things like that in terms of coping with adjusting to the disability. I know you already talked about specific issues your clients have come to you with, but I guess, do you have any comments on mental health in the blind and partially sighted community in general?
I don't know. It's kind of a hard question to answer. I don't have any hard stats on what the percentage of people with partial sight or blindness with mental health problems. There's there's different levels. So, there's someone who might be just experiencing some stress or some ableism and need someone to talk to. There might be someone who's experiencing, trouble integrating with their family and needing some help with relationships. Or there might be people who are dealing with depression and anxiety. But I don't have any of the statistics to say whether that's higher or lower than the general population.
Right. I think the takeaway is, it's like you mentioned, people have a lot of things going on and vision loss happens to be one of them. And I think overall the idea is that we're treating people, your clients may all have, or many of them may have something in common, but there are so many differences that mental health challenges that they're experiencing are ones that, are also common to many other people.
Yeah. I mean, definitely there are things that are different than, others, but there are also a lot of things that are similar and commonalities between people. So sometimes I guess I hesitate to sort of kind of single out, what are the mental health problems of, the partially sighted and blind community, because that can really pathologize us. And, it takes into consideration, I guess, maybe one of the biggest mental health problems for our community is ableism.
So more about, let's shift the focus more on, what's going wrong with the people in the community. And, instead, I think the direction that is more productive or helpful is to address the systemic issues. So maybe that's where we can go, in terms of, I think you did speak to it generally speaking, but, are there specific, can you talk a little bit about the relationship between, let's say, barriers and mental health or discrimination and mental health?
So I would say that one of the biggest barriers for the partially sighted and blind community is lack of opportunities to employment. So for someone, if they have their education and they're now trying to get a job, and no matter how many resumes or applications they send out, they still just getting no, no, no. It can be very frustrating, and it can be very easy to internalize that rejection into, something's wrong with me. It could also lead to anger. And I mean, obviously, some of that anger would be justified, but sometimes that anger can also get amplified and end up sort of being released onto other people. And so it really can have a direct connection between the experiences of ableism and barriers and what the individual person is feeling and thinking, in their own lives.
Right. So it is an individual reaction. I'm sure some people, depending when they come up against challenges, they may feel sad, angry, all kinds of grief, I'm sure, all kinds of feelings with not being able to have the same opportunities as others.
Yeah, definitely.
I think that makes more sense. I'm thinking I'm hopefully starting to get it a little bit more.
Sure.
Well, I guess in terms of mental health, the other thing that I would be curious about is, what are some things that people can do? I mean, counseling is a great option.
Yes,
and I
definitely.
think more people should do it. But do you have any other strategies or things that people can do to take care of their mental health?
Definitely. There's lots of things that people can do. One of the things that I talk about with almost all of my clients is exercise or movement, because there is a definite connection to how we feel in our physical body and how we feel in our mental, mind. And this can be anything, can be anything starting from chair yoga, up to running a marathon and anything in between. But just finding some regular exercise or movement can really help shift your mood. And then also kind of considering, self-care strategies. What are things that you enjoy to reduce your stress or to let go when you're feeling those hard emotions? A lot of people like meditation or breathing exercises, and you can find lots of those on the web, and they can be very helpful both to do on a regular basis and to do when you're really having that moment of needing some help with a more kind of like urgent emotional need.
Yeah, I think that the self-care piece, it's very individual. There are certain things that work for certain people, but in my experience, you kind of have to figure out what works for you as well.
For sure. Yeah. I think one thing is to kind of decide, like, what do you need right now? What type of self-care? So do you need something more energizing and energetic, or do you need something more calming and quiet? Do you need something more tactile or more sensory? Do you need to talk to a friend and have more social connection? But just trying to kind of tap into what is it that you sort of need in that moment. And again, there's always room for trial and experimenting to see what it is that really works for you.
I hope you don't mind me mentioning, I noticed on your website you might have mentioned that you also enjoy engaging in exercise or other things like that. I saw that you have done a half marathon. Is that right?
I did. Yes, I did. I did it with a combination of walking and running. So I didn't run the whole way. And even now, I still do a combination of walking and running. I've never made it fully completely to running. But it is something that I do enjoy. And I connected to one of the, accessible recreation groups. I joined Achilles. And so besides the exercise, I also have found a great community there for social connection. And it's something that I look forward to all the time whenever I go for a group walk or run with Achilles.
Awesome. Do you have any other groups, activities that you'd like to share?
I've definitely done yoga before. For a while, there was a Latin dance group that was going on, and unfortunately, the teacher wasn't able to continue long term. So now, once the pandemic is over, I'm going to look into some other dance studios to see if I can find some Latin dance classes. I like cats, and I love reading.
Do you have a cat?
I'm right now actually in between cats. I had a very old senior cat, and his time came in March.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're about ready to start looking for our next cat, but unfortunately, there's actually not as many cats available. I guess because people have been adopting quite a few of them during the pandemic.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's sort of a mixed blessing. It's
Yes.
great for the cats, but hopefully for you, you'll be able to find your cat.
Mm-hmm. And that's another great mental health strategy. Is having animals around. Whether you're a cat person or a dog person or some other type of animal, they can definitely provide a lot of love and companionship.
Mm-hmm. Oh, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, I feel like I have learned a lot about counseling and your work. And, I feel like I've learned a little bit more about how to approach thinking about mental health in the context of ableism or disability.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else that you want to share or talk about before we wrap up?
I guess just going back to that point about that, sometimes making that first inquiry can be the hardest part. A lot of people sometimes think that it's a weakness to ask for help. And I don't see it as a weakness. I actually see it as a strength. And so asking for help is really, something not to be afraid of, but, to look towards that things are going to be possible and that, things might change once you ask for help.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Thank you so much for your time, Lisa.
No problem.
And now a message from our sponsor. Discover AMI's collection of podcasts created by and for the blind and partially sighted community. Visit ami.ca to learn more. AMI entertains, informs, and empowers. And now, back to the podcast.
Today I am joined by Elizabeth Mohler, and I could go on for an hour about Elizabeth's achievements, but instead I will let her speak for herself. Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi, Jeff. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Elizabeth Mohler. I use she, her, and L pronouns. I became part of the Balance family in 2013 when I was a client receiving orientation and mobility instruction, community access facilitation, as it was then called, and assistive technology instruction. I joined the Balance board in 2015 as a member at large and became an employee of Balance in 2016, where I was an assistive technology specialist and community engagement lead. I left Balance in 2019, but not for long. I'm back on this podcast, and I've also done some consulting. So some of you might hear my voice in the pre-employment program workshops or other workshops that Balance has done over the years. I'm also a doctoral candidate at Western University. I'm going to my 4th year, and I look at how discourses and practices within self-managed attendant care shape how individuals access self-managed attendant care. I also run my own little consulting business called EM Disability Consulting. I am a writer, presenter, and I am the vice president of our student union of graduate students at Western University.
So you are a writer. What is your book?
I co-authored a book with Dr. Mahadi Sukai in 2016 called Creating a Culture of Accessibility in the Sciences. I am not a scientist, but I sort of dealt with the more practical space learning environments and how folks maybe who want to do placements and who live with a disability experience barriers, as well as getting into professional programs and how students have experienced barriers in those programs. So I kind of tackled that part of the book, and Dr. Sukai did more of the sciencey science lab stuff. And then we had a number of other contributors as well that made the book possible. So shout out to all those folks.
Right. We'll have a link to that book in our description as well. You are currently a doctoral candidate at Western University, as you mentioned, School of Occupational Sciences. What's your research include?
Yeah, so my research looks at a program called Ontario Direct Funding or Self-Managed Attendant Care. And I look at how discourses, so discourses really are text-based language that uses to describe the program, looking at the wording used, the tone used. So the discourse is kind of just a way of talking about language and how we speak. So I look at how discourses and practices shape how people access self-managed attendant care, and specifically how that program frames conceptions of care for people with disabilities. So this is a program where people receive funding and then they hire and train and onboard their own attendants to provide support in the home as needed. I am also a host of the show Gradcast at Western University. So you can find us on the radio on Wednesday mornings at 11 o'clock, 94.9 in London, or just go to the Western radio station, or look us up anywhere you get your podcast. Of course, that's one thing I do at Western. And as well, I mentioned that I am a vice president of our student union.
That's a really hot topic right now, isn't it? With direct funding into...
Yes, it is a very hot topic. And I think it's going to become a hotter topic as we age in place.
I think so, and I also hope so.
Me too.
Now, the two of us have a lot in common. We're both coffee addicts. We both love the McKenzie brothers.
How did you know about coffee and the McKenzie brothers? Where did you find those things out about me?
Oh, I don't know. But we also joined Balance in and around the same time in 2013, and both joined as clients because I also joined in 2013. I was going to college downtown, and I needed some help getting from St. Andrew's Subway to Recording Arts Canada. I've also
10 years. This is kind of cool. It's like our 10-year anniversary with Balance.
It really is. And then, we've both found employment through Balance. I started as the producer of the Living Blind podcast in 2022.
And might I say, you're doing a great job.
Well, thank you. But you're here because you were one of the top donors of the most recent Because of Balance campaign. So first of all, congratulations.
Thank you. It's a great cause.
But one of the prizes of being a top donor was getting to pick your favorite episode of this very podcast and then having the option to come on here and talk about it. So you chose to cash in your prize, and so here we are today. The one you chose was Mental Health Matters with Lisa Derencinovic. Now, I look at the work that Lisa does and the interview that she did with Naomi, and I look at your own work, and I see a lot of parallels there, and I can see how there's an affinity there in just the way you, like, not only the work that you do, but the way that you approach people. If I had to sort of sum you up, I would sort of say that you have a very human side to activism.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I certainly try. I think you're right. There are a lot of parallels. One thing that I often tell people, because they see the word occupation and they might think I'm an OT or an occupational health and safety nurse. So occupational science, I could do a whole podcast on what that is. It really has to do with human doing and how the environment and the individual interact and shape one another. But yeah, I think that occupational science lens brings that humanness to the activism work that I do. Although I don't offer clinical advice or counseling, I've done a lot of mentorship through the National Educational Association of Disabled Students or NEEDS since 2013. Boy, I was busy in 2013. And I've also done some coaching and mentorship through workshops at Balance, as well as the Ontario Chamber of Commerce. And I think, one of the things that, as you were speaking, Jeff, I was thinking about is how I bring, and Lisa said this too, my own experience of living with a visible disability to my work, and whether that be using practical everyday examples, or whether that be framing my position as a researcher around why I came to the work that I did, or whether it's just the types of things I'm interested in. I do believe that because of my disability, that's shaped the types of questions I want to ask and the types of ideas I want to explore.
And aside from the fact that you, as you said, you are not a counselor, you do not offer counseling yourself, your approach to advocacy and activism and accessibility and just creating a culture of accessibility, as you've said, you really enjoy getting to know people one-on-one.
I do.
And I think the causes and activism and some of the language surrounding activism in terms of the more sort of on the side of law might be sort of either off-putting or a little bit overwhelming to people in terms of their rights and just means of access. But getting to know them one-on-one, what they're having trouble with, what they're struggling with, and the fact that they can't get it, and the fact that it's the 21st century and we're talking about things that are so simple. Do you see that as well?
I do. And I think, you're bringing up some really important points around, what I sometimes call in my writing, the invisible work of advocacy. So sometimes we'll hear as students or as new employees or as job seekers or as clients, you just need to advocate. You need to advocate for yourself. And absolutely 1000% we do, but there's a lot of invisible work. You could be spending hours on the phone calling ODSP to see if you can get an electronic statement, or you could be spending hours on the phone with your bank because the app's not accessible. And so that's kind of that, I say invisible because people don't see the work. And sometimes advocacy can be exhausting. So there's an emotional piece too. There's the emotional labor of doing all that work and explaining what you need. But it also can be very rewarding when you've made a stride and all of a sudden on campus there's an audible pedestrian signal, or on campus there's Braille beside the washrooms. Then that sort of all of that work, you sort of feel that aha moment. And I think that one of the things I try to do when I'm speaking to administrators or when I'm speaking to fellow student leader colleagues is to talk about access as everybody's can to carry and everybody's challenge to negotiate, because accessibility benefits everybody. So one of the taglines that I like to use is accessibility is for everyone. So I will often use very concrete examples. Like if you send materials out in advance of a meeting, everybody comes prepared with questions. People aren't distracted in the meeting reading a document they've just got, and our time is used more effectively. So it isn't just send it in advance for Elizabeth, that all of a sudden is everybody's going to benefit. And so, back to your sort of human side of activism and being able to sort of draw parallels, between my work and Lisa's, I think one of the things I heard from Lisa in her podcast interview was really being able to use her experience to teach and to educate. And I like to think that I do that as well.
Absolutely, because one thing that might elude people is accessibility is for everybody, but what about me? And if you are, for example, that person organizing the meeting, for example, as you said, you might not be thinking of, just if we're doing this for one person. So let's say, for example, someone is told, get the talking points for this meeting out in advance for Elizabeth, for just the one person. They might kind of go, okay. They might think they might do it, they might not. But that really goes a long way in the educational aspect, because once you have them, then you can be prepared yourself, and then you can make contributions to that meeting. People will then take note of those contributions. They might get to know you better, and they might hear ideas from you that they never would have thought of, and then the whole project goes much smoother.
Yeah, for sure. And, it's a work in progress. I'm on several different committees and boards, some through church, some through school, some just through community life. And some, I think that needle moves a little bit slower in some spheres than others. But it is true, when you have the materials in advance, not only can you come prepared to make contributions, but it's also, again, that teaching moment. What about people that couldn't be present at the meeting that want to participate asynchronously? They can do that if they're getting stuff ahead of time. So I think, this access is for everybody is really important, especially as we're moving into this, what have we learned and what have we unlearned from COVID? So when we think about COVID, and I know Lisa recorded her episode during COVID, we had to rethink how we did things. And a lot of that rethinking made it easier for people that live with disabilities to participate. I know several colleagues that got their first job because they could finally work from home on Zoom, and they didn't have to worry about negotiating Wheel-Trans or care needs and attendant care needs at work. So that was a really big thing too. And for myself, I go to school in London. I live in Toronto, just to confuse everybody. I'm in two different cities. And so it meant for me in my first year, I wasn't commuting. I was doing my coursework on Zoom and putting that energy that I would have otherwise used commuting into Zoom and into school on Zoom, which was a lot easier and more effective. And even things like, how we socialize has changed. And there's a lot more spaces that have opened up for activism online. Disability Twitter really ballooned and blossomed during COVID because it had to. So I think there's a lot of ways that accessibility, we've learned through COVID, how accessibility actually is this practice that works really well for everybody.
Just for reference, for those of you who might not be in Ontario or in Canada, the distance between Toronto and London is about a 3 or 4 hour drive and a
2 hours.
2 hours
2 hour
drive.
train ride. Yes,
2 hour train ride.
Yes.
And even more if you were taking the bus.
Yes.
Now, if you did that daily.
I don't do it daily. Usually now I commute in once a week and stay overnight, but it is a commute for sure.
Yeah. Coming from someone who did do a daily commute of 2 hours one way every day, so I guess you could say 4 hours each day. I get what that is. Yes. But going back to educating the educators, do you think one of the words that we hear a lot now is ableism? Mm-hmm. Ableism and barriers to ableism. This is another thing that Lisa touched on. Barriers to ableism. And barriers come in many different forms. There are ableist barriers, but barriers of ableism will then also lead to attitudinal barriers. That can also lead to internal barriers within the people that are being excluded in this case. Do you think that this is hot right now? And do you see a way forward?
Yeah, I think Lisa did a really lovely job explaining ableism. We might be familiar with terms like racism. We might be familiar with this concept of sort of gender inequality, but ableism tends to elude people. I like to kind of think of ableism as sort of this beliefs or attitude that able-bodiedness is superior and that differences in body minds are inferior. And unfortunately, it can be very systemic. So meaning it can come in the form of policy, everyday attitudes, practices, environmental ableism. And I think, to Lisa's point, it can really impact our mental health. So one word that comes to mind for me is internalized ableism. So you start to believe some of the attitudes. So maybe I can't go to school because I'm somebody that has vision loss, or maybe I can't get a job or live on my own. And I think where that's really harmful is then we kind of we self-perpetuate. So I think one of the pieces around ableism that's going to be really important is we see our demographics, right? So our stats tell us that 22% of people in Canada right now are living with disabilities, and that's going to rise as the population continues to age. So I think one of the things that I'm hopeful for is that in Ontario here, we have the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, or AODA. We have 2 new standards, education and health, that are going to be rolled out. And those will hopefully help push that needle forward to remove barriers. And also we have an Accessible Canada Act, which came out in 2019. So for federally regulated organizations to be more inclusive. And we don't just want to think about what we have to do, but what can we do to remove barriers? It's not, well, what's the bare minimum, but what can we do?
I've been thinking, just on a personal note, we can touch on this as well. But then there's the whole mental health aspect I would like to get into as well. Yeah. But when I think of the word ableism, there's a lot of nuance. That word can be really big and also really subtle at the same time. Because humor me this. As someone who was born blind myself, I grew up in a mainstream environment. For a bit of background, your 2 choices for schooling are you go to a mainstream school like the majority of other people, or you can go to a specialized school for the blind. And you learn to integrate. And it was only later on in life that I really started to meet more blind people and people like myself, and could talk and could address and talk about things that I just couldn't talk about with other people before. But I think that a lot of times people just don't know what ableism is, or they might take it to heart and think that there's something wrong with being able-bodied. And I think that there's a lot more education and just one-on-one conversations in the general public that could lead to much more agreeable and a lot more just easier ways of getting things done.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I was also born blind, and I went to a mainstream school for grade 1s here in my local community. And then I went to a school that had a classroom for folks with sight loss until the end of 5th grade. And then I went to a school for the blind. And it's interesting, exactly what you say. There were just things that I I think I always knew that there was other kids out there like me, but I never really got to fully experience that until I went to a school with a live-in program. And I think what was interesting is I got to then participate in sports and music. And I got to do things like, outdoor club that I just couldn't do in the mainstream school because there wasn't supports. And so I kind of, when I'm doing workshops, especially for little kids, and I'm talking about inclusion in schools, I often kind of talk about it as if, sort of like Harry Potter, right? Like when he was not at Hogwarts, he knew there was something different about him, but he didn't really know what it was. And he didn't really have a great time in his homeschool. And then he went to Hogwarts. He's like, wow, there's people like me. I can do really cool stuff. So I kind of use that comparison because it is true. If we don't have people in our lives that we can talk to about these challenges that we might be facing, or even just, hey, I want to try this. Have you done it? Then it can be very isolating for sure.
Absolutely. And I think that it's easier than a lot of people think it is.
Mm-hmm.
There's not this us and them divide that we
mm-hmm.
as as a society are meant to have been accustomed to for millennia.
Yeah, for sure.
And just on a personal note, thank you. I've never read Harry Potter before. I thought it all started at Hogwarts.
Oh, well, no, Jeff, next episode, we'll talk about Harry Potter. You got to read it.
All right. Maybe something, we'll work that in somewhere. But going back to ableism and attitudinal barriers and leading to internalizing, that does a lot of mental health, doesn't it?
It really does. And I think part of it is, just knowing how to express that and how to get that support. I think, one of the things I love about the work that Lisa does is that, and she says it really well. She has experience with sight loss, but everyone's experience is different. But being able to talk to someone who might be able to say, yes, I've been through something similar, or I can appreciate what you're going through. I know that those barriers exist. I think can be really affirming. And that's I think a big part of counseling, right, is being affirmed and to feel like somebody really is validating what you're experiencing and saying. And I think part of it too is the education. Like if you've just lost your sight, you don't know what you don't know. You don't know that there's recreation groups for people in your city, perhaps for people with sight loss, or you don't know that there's a screen reader on the computer. So I think being able to have those touch points, those people you can go to say, hey, what's out there and how can I do this is really important. Because otherwise you can become quite isolated, I think.
I think the two of you bring a lot of yourselves and your own values into your work, which can really help with the connection side and the empathy side, because while no one has the same two experiences, and you might be talking to someone who's had a totally different life and comes from a totally different set of experiences than yourself, there is a lot of commonality, and we're not so different, you and I. And I think that I think that really leads to a lot of really deep and meaningful connections. And it, especially when you mention someone, if we take that example of someone who's recently gone blind for the first time, or just someone who's delving into something new, from Lisa's point, seeking counseling for the first time, you might be feeling very vulnerable because you are talking to someone whom you don't know at the start, and you're talking about things that are fundamental to you and they are very deep at your core. And that does introduce a lot of vulnerability, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And I think sometimes too, depending on our background and our situation, we might not have always had the most positive experiences with the healthcare system or with counseling. So we're hesitant because maybe we have experienced ableism, whether it be systemic or attitudinal, or we've experienced microaggressions. So microaggressions are sort of very subtle, implicit forms of discrimination that are put forward towards specific minority groups. So in this case, disability, although microaggressions can exist for many different groups. So it could be something as simple as a comment, are you actually going to be able to do that if you can't see? So the implication being like, you couldn't do that. Or are you going to be able to manage getting home by yourself from this appointment? So those things kind of, they're very subtle, but they are there. And on my blog, I have a whole blog post called Managing Microaggressions, just so you know.
Thank you for sort of bringing light to the word microaggressions, because it's become kind of a buzzword, and it's familiar to some and alienating to others who might not be in on.
Yeah.
Yet they impact everyone.
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And I think they're hard to pin because they're so subtle. So sometimes subtle comments can be really hard. So like a very practical example, and I'm sure most of the listeners with sight loss can identify with this one, is we're out with a friend or a colleague, and we're in a restaurant or a cafe, or and the server speaks to our friend or colleague and not to us. So that's a very subtle microaggression, right? But there's a lot to unpack there about who do we believe is competent and capable to make decisions, and who do we feel comfortable with, right? Because we all like people like us, and when we see difference, it's unsettling and it's disruptive. And so I think the natural reaction is to focus on having a conversation with somebody that is more like us, but sort of breaking that stigma. So sometimes what I do is I'll answer. So if I'm out with you, Jeff, and somebody speaks to you and says, what would Elizabeth like? I'll say, oh, well, I'd like a coffee, please. So I'll just sort of bridge that conversation.
How was that introduced to you? Because did you find that was happening a lot when you were younger? I'm just kind of bringing my own personal experience into this too.
Yeah.
When did that first come to your attention that was something that was going on?
Yeah, for me, I noticed it. So I don't recall when it started happening, but I noticed it in university when I'd be out with friends, so whether we're at a restaurant and the server looks to them, or, I'd be at the bank and the teller would look to the person to read my balance or assist me. And so actually I remember to plug balance for a moment. It was in 2013, because I'd noticed this throughout undergrad and grad school and didn't really know kind of how to handle it. And one of the O&M instructors I had at Balance at the time, we were out together doing some work at a bank to learn the route to the bank and navigate inside the bank building. And the instructor said to me, when people do that, I just look away and I'll walk away and I'll indicate to them that they are to speak to you. So she said, that's a tip you can use when you're out with friends, is just getting them to sort of redirect to you, or perhaps even physically step back a bit. So that tip was courtesy of Paula, an O&M instructor that worked at Balance.
I was just going to ask you if it was Paula Huber, because she was my instructor at the time as well.
It's a great tip.
It was great. It's great. I'm going to do that actually. Next time someone speaks to me and not someone else.
Yep.
First
she
of all,
said just sort of physically sort of back up a little bit and then sort of look to the person that they should be speaking to, and then sort of nod and then just say, oh, you can ask them. So yeah, a shout out to Paula for that one.
I just had an interesting thought. If someone ever does that to me rather than the person, if I'm the one that's being spoken to rather than the one being spoken for, I don't know what that person, I'm trying to think of what that person is thinking of my friend who's with me. And I don't really want to go there because it can be, it's kind of ugly. Yeah. But kind of just to go on my own personal experience as well. It was actually my vision teacher who brought this to my attention when I was in high school. My vision teacher, her name was Carol Gear. If she's listening to this podcast, hi, Carol, how are you? If I had to describe Carol's motto, even though she never said it herself, I don't think anybody in the profession ever would. But I would say her motto is, you'll thank me later. I'm not here to win any popularity contest. You're not going to like me at times, but these are tools that are going to set you up for life. And she knew that these were things that were overwhelming to someone who's just trying to make it through the day as a teenager. But I can recall this discussion where, in my case, it was teachers coming up to me, or other staff in the school coming up to her rather, and asking about, does he need the note assignments, or can he go out to this area, or, such and such. And she brought it up to me. She goes, why are they asking me? This is your assignment. These are your places to go. They should be asking you. And at the time, I was also struggling with just being proactive and just being approachable. But I guess to be approached, you have to be approachable, but also just approaching people. I know that's going to be tricky for some to hear on this podcast because I'm yammering away right now. But I did struggle with going up to people and making a case for myself.
Oh, for sure.
But now, absolutely, it's become that, and it doesn't have to be a hello, look at me over here with waving the hands and all that. But you can just very subtly come in and just carry on the conversation, and then eventually the person will pick up on that.
Yeah, for sure.
So it's a very subtle way of doing that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Was there anything else from Lisa's interview that you wanted to pick up on?
Yeah, I just want to sort of touch on employment, because we know that our stats are like between 32 and 35% of folks with sight loss in Canada that have employment. And if we look at generally the disability community, it's about 49% of people that are employed, and then 80% of non-disabled people are employed. Now, those stats are a little bit old. It's 2017 Canadian Survey on Disability. So hopefully with our census from 2021, we'll get some fresh new stats. But I bring that up because, work isn't just something that we do because we have to. Work gives us a sense of purpose and identity. It gives us fulfillment by building connections and relationships. It prevents us from becoming sort of mentally bored. So we get mental stimulation and that kind of thing from work. But also I think work gives us a sense of accomplishment. You feel good at the end of the day when you've put a big proposal together or you've done a really great presentation. And so when we don't have those things, our confidence starts to wane because we don't have those sort of those measures of accomplishment. And I think, I do want to point out it's okay if people can't work for medical reasons. There's certainly no shaming in that and blaming in that. But I think the opportunity for people to work and to work in different ways should be there. And again, I harken back to COVID because what COVID's taught us is people can work in different ways. We can do gig economy, we can do freelance work, we can do remote work, we can do flexi work. Although that's been controversial lately with sort of people pushing to return to the office. And so I really, when Lisa talked about that bit around employment, I really resonated. It took me 4 years, Jeff, to find a full-time job. I graduated from my master's in 2012, and it wasn't until 2016 that I landed that first full-time paying job. And it was a balance, actually.
There's a couple things I want to pick up on because that goes back to the whole internalization fact, to the internalizing. Because of making a case for services, for advocacy, for work, for accessibility for the disabled community. We do measure in statistics like that because policies are data-driven. And so when we see stats like you mentioned, 35% of people with blindness or low vision are employed, the subtle message that gets sent to someone else is, well, I'm not employed right now. I'm one of those statistics. And that can lead to a bit of a mental, that just brings even more pressure to perform because that does bring work down to those most basic principles of making, needing work to have a living or just finding work so that you're not someone without a job. But I think, as you mentioned, work is so much more than that because it gives you a sense of accomplishment and it gives others reward as well. Whether the work that you do then impacts others, whatever that work is. And I think that there is so much that we can move on going forward. And I hope that everyone from employers and employees themselves to agencies, to the governments themselves, everywhere. I don't just mean provincially. I don't just mean municipally. I don't just mean federally. Everywhere, understand that there is a lot of flexibility that goes around to this. You'd mentioned people who can't work and COVID. There are people who can work in many different capacities. If you can't leave your home, absolutely, you can still work. If you're at a point where you are totally fine and you can work, and then something happens to you and you can't work again and you have to maybe go back on some assisted living for a while, there's no shame. There shouldn't be any shame in that too. You should not be punished for then having to go back or to be refused to having to go back to not being able to work for a while you get yourself settled. There's a lot of flexibility because what does that say? Then we're back to square one.
Yeah.
I failed again,
Yeah.
It's so there's a lot that we have going forward.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, just to sort of cap onto that, something that's really hard from sort of a mental health and confidence perspective is when all your peers are landing those jobs and you're not. And it's partly because, at least my experience in school, we're really trained as people with disabilities to focus on school because it does take us longer. So, don't do extracurriculars, don't work part-time, don't do a co-op. And so I think one of the really big challenges is that we have to sort of navigate that. And as a result, we don't have as much experience. So when we're coming out of school, we've graduated. We don't have that experience like our able-bodied peers, and we're not able to land those jobs as quickly. So sometimes we might have to volunteer, or sometimes we might have to do some upskilling and skill building.
For all the students out there is absolutely no shame in taking extra time, taking 3 courses a semester instead of 4. And even if you have to graduate later on, that's totally fine. You're there for yourself. Yes, you're there to make friends as well. Like, that is a huge part. I don't want to underestimate that, but it's not that these go hand in hand. But it is not a competition. You're there to make the most of it. And in some cases, if it's post-secondary, you're paying for it. There's no shame in taking 3 courses and lightening the load for a month. And there's no shame. In fact, my best experiences, and I'm sure this is the case with you too, Elizabeth, were co-ops, were field placements, were volunteer, And so if you have to take an extra year, 2 years for that, so be it. There is going to be that little bit of, even if someone is in high school listening to this, I know we have more adults listening, but again, this all goes from very young. If you're in high school and you take a victory lap, there's no shame on it.
I had grade 13. It was the best year of my high school.
I made my own grade 13 because they didn't have it by the time I got to school. And so I
12.0.
12.0, yeah. 12.2.0. And I think it was only after I started doing it that everyone else realized, hey, that's a really good idea. Everyone under me wanted to take an extra year because they realized how good it was.
There you go.
No,
Trailblazer.
Hey, there we go. Well, we've come up, I don't know how long this recording's been, but we could go for another 3 hours just based on off of each other. Were there any final thoughts that you had on just Lisa's work, or anything you wanted to say?
No, thank you so much for having me. I think we've covered a lot of ground, and I'm really excited to see what will come next in the way of accessibility. I think we're at sort of a reckoning as we move into an endemic of COVID, and we move with these Accessible Canada Acts and new AODA standards. I think it's an exciting time.
An endemic.
Yes.
Think we'll start seeing that word soon in the news?
I think so.
I think so. Do you think it'll be as restrictive as COVID?
I hope not.
I hope not either. All right. Well, that is going to do it for this interview for Living Blind. It will be the end of June by the time this comes out. Everyone, have a great summer. You have a great summer, Elizabeth.
You too, Jeff.
Be sure to check out the show notes for resources and information regarding mental health supports, as well as the contact info for both Lisa and Elizabeth. And with that, that's going to wrap things up for a 3rd season of Living Blind. But not only is it the finale for this season, it is also the final installment with yours truly as producer. It's been a great run, and I have thoroughly enjoyed working on this podcast for Balance for Blind Adults and for our awesome listening audience. So I hope you will allow me an extended credits list to acknowledge the entire team that has brought this podcast to you during my time at the controls. Host, Naomi Hazlett. Guest hosts, Eve Purvin, Ramya Amuthan, and Madeline Somerville. Communications coordinators, Rana Shalcoro and Chloe Thibault. Development officer, Deanna Carruthers. Web developer, Sandy Feldman. Marketing, Damon Gruel and Priyanka Bakchi. Transcriber, Greg Pikios. My predecessor, Troy Taylor, and of course, the executive producer, Deborah Gold. Finally, my biggest thank you of all is to you, the listener. And please continue to provide us with your comments, questions, and suggestions for future installments. Get in touch with the podcast on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter by searching Balance for Blind Adults, and chat with other listeners in the Living Blind Listeners Facebook group. You can also email us at livingblindpodcast@balancefba.org. For more information about Balance for Blind Adults and our programs and services, or to access the show notes and transcription of this episode, please visit us at www.balancefba.org. I'm Jeffrey Rainey, and this has been Living Blind Throwback Thursday. Thanks for listening, and have a great summer.
Are you interested in supporting Balance for Blind Adults? Visit our brand new Ways to Give page at www.balancefba.org. Here, you can learn about social media birthday celebrations, hosting your own event, donating your car, honoring a loved one's memory, and celebrating important milestones like graduations or retirements. There are other great ways to give, like gifts of securities and leaving a gift in your will. And of course, we are always grateful for monthly and one-time gifts. Thank you for helping Balance provide an open world for persons who are blind or living with sight loss.